The NFL Draft Combine is behind us, and we got a good look at the next generation of NFL players. Today, I want to talk about 25 to 30 of them, and I will say, hey, did they raise their draft stock or did they plummet it? There's a lot to talk about. Let's get into it. Starting off here with Michael Penix Jr. at the quarterback position. I'm going to go through the risers first, and of course, we'll make our way to the losers. But there's a lot of risers here. Of course, we're going to talk about the good side of NFL Combine weekend. But Michael Penix, out of all the quarterbacks that did throw, of course, him, Pro, and Bo Nix, who did have a solid day, Michael Penix just looked like the best overall thrower. Of course, he was known at Washington to have a funky throwing style, almost where his elbow and his inner arm was touching his body when he was going to release the ball. He looked like he fixed that, and it looks a lot smoother coming off of his hands. And of course, his balls were accurate. I think the biggest thing for Michael Penix this weekend were that his medicals came back clean. You know, I've seen a guy with these medical questions go as high as 11 or 12 in some mock drafts. I wouldn't go that far. I think he's more so of a day two pick, but I think his stock is definitely going to rise over the next couple of weeks. We're gonna have to see how he does at his pro day. But Michael Penix, with those medicals coming back clean and with him looking a lot smoother and the throwing motion looking a lot more natural, he's gonna shoot up these draft boards. And who knows, he could be a first round pick, maybe even in that 11 to 20 range. But at the running back position, these are some of the biggest winners. Of course, Jaylen Wright, we're going to talk about. It hurts me as a Gators fan, but I'm telling you guys from firsthand experience, he was a great player in the matchups, of course, against my Gators. But this is a guy that's just super explosive. He had a sub 4.40 time. He has that great bell cow size that you can really translate to the next level of football. Of course, he played in the toughest college conference in the SEC. He's coming to the NFL where it's going to be a very similar, of course, just a little bit more hard hitting in the NFL level, of course. But Jaylen Wright, I think, is built for the NFL level. And whether if he's a day two pick or a day three pick, this is a guy that definitely raised his draft stock with his combine performance. But again, man, if you didn't see it, super, super explosive. This guy is ready to be a day two pick, maybe for a team like the Baltimore Ravens that could use a running back, but we'll talk about that on Thursday. Maybe the Ravens go after a guy like Derrick Henry, right? But then I don't think there's anybody that had a better rise in their draft stock this weekend or a better overall weekend in general than Isaac Guerendo. Excuse me if I'm mispronouncing that, but guy out of Louisville, of course, love the Louisville Cardinals. They always have clean jerseys, or at least their away jerseys, right? But I just think no one tested better this entire weekend. He had a 4.340 time. He's just overall super explosive, but that's not even where it gets crazy. This is the best part about his weekend. Since 1987, they've been tracking running back athletic profiles as well as every other position. And out of those 1,765 total running backs that have been, graded on a athletic profile, scale, Isaac Guerendo was the fifth best athletic running back ever. He put up the fifth best athletic profile ever. This is a guy that shocked the world, is the good way to put it, and he put the world on notice. It's another good way to put it. So shout out to Isaac Guerendo, a guy that went from maybe being an undrafted prospect or a seventh round pick to maybe shooting up to the fourth, fifth round range as of right now. But again, we've seen crazier things happen. He could even go higher than that, but I wouldn't say he's more so than like a fourth, fifth round guy. But he definitely raised it from being a seventh round pick. Now he could be an early day three pick. So shout out to Isaac Guerendo. Again, nobody had a better combine than him. But moving over to the wide receiver position, and we'll make this one quick. Of course, Xavier Worthy didn't look the greatest in his drills. Of course, he had some slip ups in some of the routes, in some of the route drills. But I think, for if you run the fastest 40-yard dash of all time, you definitely raise your draft stock. We've seen it in the past with guys like John Ross, where he didn't look the greatest as far as his route running and his catching ability, but he ran the fastest 40 ever at the time, and he was drafted in the first round. In fact, really, really high, of course, by the Cincinnati Bengals. And Xavier Worthy, I think, is a guy that was a day two pick for sure. But now I think he's a guaranteed first round pick. As crazy as that might sound, I think teams are going to be like, hey, he ran the fastest 40 ever. This is a guy that can fit perfectly next to Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs. He can fit perfectly next to Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. This is a guy that might sneak into the back end of the first round, excuse me. But very excited for him, and shout out to him for setting history. It's not often we get to see that kind of stuff, so I'm excited to, I was excited when I got to see it live. So shout out to Xavier Worthy. for, of course, history. His teammate, though, on the other hand, Donnie Mitchell or AD Mitchell, more so, he had a great weekend as well. I didn't include him here in today's video, but shout out to him. The Texas boys killed it here in over the combine weekend. But then Ladd McConkey, a guy that I don't see a lot of people talking about, and maybe it's just because we expected great things from Ladd McConkey, but I still wanted to talk about him because I think he was a guy that was a day 2 pick, and I think he still is a day 2 pick, but I think instead of a third round guy, he's more so of an early to mid second round guy now. But Ladd McConkey, he had a surprising 40 in my eyes. He had a 4.39. He was expected to run a 4.4, 4.5. But he ran sub 4.40. And I just think, throughout all the drills, there wasn't many people that were better than him from a technical standpoint. He was a great route runner. He had a lot of great hands, short, quick cuts. Ladd McConkey is definitely living up to that Cooper Kupp archetype, right? I will say he reminds me of some other receivers, more so than Cooper Kupp, but I could definitely see the comparison that a lot of people are trying to make. Regardless, I think Ladd definitely had a great weekend, and he is rising up the draft board. So shout out to him again, even though he is a Georgia Bulldog. But then another guy, and I had to throw this guy in there. I had to get a Gator in there somewhere. There wasn't many great performances from the Gators, from Gator boys this over the draft combine, stretch of days. But Ricky Pearsall, I will say, did have a solid outing. This is a guy that he was in the 97th percentile for the standing vertical. He had a 42-inch vertical. Now, I know that the general fan knows this guy for that crazy and wicked one-hand catch where he goes over his body, of course, down the seam to bail out Graham Mertz and make Graham Mertz look somewhat decent at the quarterback position. But I think he's more than that, of course. I think I can see the Jordy Nelson comparisons. I can see the Wes Welker comparisons, where this is a guy that can be solid at the next level. And I know he's not the flashy, explosive Keon Coleman type, but this is a guy that I think will be the Hunter Renfrow of your team. He's solid. He's going to do exactly what you tell him to do. He's going to be in the slot, and he's going to be reliable for a franchise for 10 to 15 years, kind of like a Tyler Lockett kind of player. But he also had a strong 40, in my opinion. A 4.4 time, I think, is very solid for a guy like Ricky Pearsall, and definitely raises his draft stock. So shout out to Ricky Pearsall. He's another draft riser. Then we move over to the tight end position, and we'll talk about a guy in Theo Johnson, a guy that going into the combine was my 4th ranked tight end. I think this combine performance might move him up into maybe even my top 3 over a guy like Cade Stover, of course, projecting at the next level, but a guy that is freakishly similar as far as a profile, right? To a guy like Jimmy Graham, where they're very close in height, weight, you name it, they're very close in, which is, comps are comps for a reason, but he's definitely, it's the right comparison for a guy like Theo Johnson to be compared to Jimmy Graham. I will say that Theo Johnson is still a very raw prospect. He still has some things to work on at the next level, but I think this combine performance definitely helps his draft stock, and that's what we're talking about here in today's video. But the biggest thing about Theo Johnson, and the biggest reason why you'll see people going crazy about his performance, is that he had a 9.9 out of 10 relative athletics score. It is I forget the creator, but he releases these scores each and every year, and it's basically, it takes all the combined. It goes back to 1987. I'll say this. It goes back to 1987, and they take every player at that certain position and they grade them on a scale of 1 to 10, depending on how well they did, their height, weight, and of course how well they performed at the combine. Theo Johnson had a 9.9 out of 10. Very hard to do. And of course, there's only been 110, I believe, ever on that grading scale. So Theo Johnson, amazing. He tested very well. Again, like I mentioned, he's still very raw, has some things to work on at the next level, especially when it comes to catching the ball. But Theo Johnson definitely has the potential to be very solid at the next level. And again, when you're 6'6" and you run like Jimmy Graham, you could definitely find yourself a very long future here in the National Football League. But then some offensive lineman love here. Let's talk about Joe Alt. Of course, he was my number 1 coming into the draft. I thought he was the clear-cut number 1 going into the combine. And I think he is now more so than ever the clear-cut number 1 offensive tackle in this class. That is loaded, by the way. You have guys like Talise Fuaga, of course, Olu Fashanu, who didn't have the greatest day, and we'll talk about that later. You have guys like J.C. Latham, Quarius Mims, guys that had amazing weekends. But Joe Alt, I think, still stands clear and above all those other guys because he measured in. We had him measured in around 6'7", 6'8". This guy is 6'9", and the doctors say he's not even done growing. So this is a huge individual, but it's not. That's not even where That's not why you get hype about Joe Alt, right? This is a guy that had a 5:05:40, which is very fast for a guy that his size. It's freakishly fast. Like I mentioned for Theo Johnson, those relative athletic scores, I view them very highly, and he had a 9.9 score out of 10. So he tested very well for his height, his weight, you name it. This dude had it all over the combine performance. But I do also want to say the reason why you get hype around him is because of this stuff you see on your screen. Also, for the fact that this guy allowed 1 sack in his entire collegiate career, and he was a day one starter, by the way. So Joe Alt, amazing collegiate player. He's definitely going to be that next Joe Thomas, that next franchise changing left tackle. I could see him in Tennessee here in just a few weeks. But Joe Alt, of course, we want to show some love to the guys up front. But then let's talk about some other honorable mentions that I honestly just didn't want to make a graphic for. But Trey Benson, I think, solidified himself as running back one in this class. I was called crazy for having him over guys like Blake Corum, and I understand Blake Corum also had a very good weekend. However, Trey Benson, I just think he was my overall running back one coming into the combine, and he had a great combine performance. He solidified himself as the one running back one for me going into the NFL draft, unless something crazy happens, right? Like a knee injury or something of that nature. But Trey Benson, I think, is going to be very good at the next level. It all just depends on where he lands. J.C. Latham and Talise Fuaga, I talked about them, of course, for the Oregon State Beavers, for Talise Fuaga, and of course, Bama for J.C. Latham. Both guys are huge individuals, and they had very solid outings, both of them a lot quicker. Both of them move very quick for their size, especially a guy like J.C. Latham and a guy I didn't have on the graphic here in Aquarius Mims, a guy that, Daniel Jeremiah called an Avenger, right? Because that guy is 6'8" and moves very fast. I've seen some guys even compare him to a guy like Thanos. But there's a lot of offensive tackle talent in this class. And of course, you heard me talk about Joe Alt, but the guys under him are so very, very talented. And I can see 3 or 4 of these guys having very long careers because there's always 1 or 2 of them that always struggle at the next level. But at the tight end position, also Ben Sinnott or Ben Sinnott. I'm going to assume it is Ben Sinnott. Regardless, out of Kansas State, this is a guy that is, he's shorter, right? He's 6'4" ish, which is not short, right? But for an NFL tight end, you'd like him to be a little bit taller. But this is a guy I can see being a fullback or an H-back at the next level, a guy that can be kind of like a Kyle Juszczyk, which that's not a slight in any sense of the word. This is a guy in Kyle Juszczyk that is a pivotal part of that San Francisco 49ers offense, a huge blocker, but he can also get out there and make a play with the ball and run routes and do everything that the Niners need him to do. I can see Ben Sinnott doing that for another team. It all just depends, again, on where he goes because a team like San Fran has their fullback. Can he go to a team like, I'm just throwing it out there. What if he goes to a team like Tennessee, right? Could he be that generational, fullback for them, whether if they have Tyjae Spears back there or they draft a running back because they're most likely going to get a tackle here. So very quickly, that Tennessee offense could build something up behind Joe Alt and Ben Sinnott. Of course, that would be in the later rounds of the draft. But these are some other draft risers here. But let's, of course, talk about the flip side. Of course, the other side of the coin. Actually, the defensive side of the ball. Can't believe I forgot about that. But let's talk about maybe one of my favorite prospects in the class, in Peyton Wilson, a guy that I had as my 3rd-ranked linebacker. And I know Edgerrin Cooper and I know Jeremiah Trotter. Those both tested well, but Peyton Wilson might be moving up in my rankings. He might even be my number 1 or number 2 linebacker going into the NFL draft. We'll have to dive into some more film, right? But Peyton Wilson, I mean, he had 4.40, super explosive. I mean, you want to talk about an off-ball linebacker that can move sideline to sideline? Peyton Wilson is definitely in that running, right? But I will say there was a downfall to this weekend. His medical concerns, they didn't necessarily come back clean, right? He's had a history of injuries and a history, of course, in the medical side. But they didn't really come back clean. So I will say there's concern for drafting a guy like Peyton Wilson, but he could end up like a guy like, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, Cormora, of course, way more talented prospect, right? I don't want to get that twisted. But Peyton Wilson could be a guy that is very talented and he's going to land on a contender that takes a shot on him, and he could be very, very solid. Hypothetically, again, throwing it out there, what if a Patrick Queen doesn't return to the Baltimore Ravens? I could see Peyton Wilson going into the Baltimore side of things, playing for a contender right next to Roquan Smith and being a very dominant, explosive outside linebacker for him. Or hey, even if he wants to slide in to be the middle linebacker, right? I know they run a 3-4, but you guys get the picture. I think this guy is going to be very solid. I just hope he lands with a contender at the next level. But let's talk about, you know what, I'm going to say the number one guy of the weekend. You know why? Because he's from a small school. Nobody heard of this guy, including myself. And this guy just put everybody on notice. Jalyx Hunt out of Houston Christian. And I had to look up their team name. And I'm not afraid to admit it. They are the Houston Christian Huskies. So shout out to Jalyx Hunt. But he's a linebacker, a guy that had a 4.5, 4.6 40. And I'm going to say he's the number one player. And I want to shout out to him because he put these smaller schools on the map, right? So there's always one guy every year, right? But Jalyx Hunt, shout out to him. He's a linebacker. He should be a day 3 pick, but super explosive. And again, for being at a small school to come out here and nobody know who he is, or at least not the diehards, and he puts the world on notice. Shout out to Jalyx Hunt. He's going to be a day 3 pick, and I'm very excited for him in his future. I kind of hope that he ends up being one of the best in the league just because of his story. But then we talk about the edge rushers in Latu Latu. You guys know this is my favorite prospect in this entire draft. And for a lot of good reasons. His athleticism this weekend, of course, we knew he was always technically sound, whether if he was, before he transferred to UCLA or when he was there and he played his best football. We knew he was always technically sound, but his athleticism, we wanted to see that match his technique, right? And I think the combine was a huge way for him to show that. And I think he did. I think his athleticism and all of his drills matched his great technique. And I think that's going to play huge for him at the next level, whether if he's the first, second, or even third edge rusher off the board. And also the biggest thing for me this weekend is that his medicals came back clean. Of course, once he had to medically retire from the game of football due to a neck injury, and he eventually made his way back and say, hey, doc, I think I can play. They cleared him, and then he went on to play his best career football at UCLA. He's my favorite edge rusher in this class, and a guy that, again, another guy that just has a great story. And there's no world that this happens, right? But hopefully the Browns can trade up and grab him, right? I would love to see that. But then Dallas Turner, another guy that, of course, was very high on our draft boards. He was 2A or 2B for me, right next to Jared Verse. But a guy that just stole the show. Great size. He had 4.4 40 time, very explosive. And this is a guy that I think solidified himself as a top 10 pick. I could see him wearing red, but just in a different shade for the Atlanta Falcons here in just a couple weeks. But who knows? Somebody else could trade up for him, or who knows, maybe he falls to the Minnesota Vikings or a team of that nature. But Dallas Turner, I think, solidified himself as a top 10 pick. I don't think I think I would prefer Latu Latu over him at the NFL level. But again, it's all preference. This is the most versatile edge in the class. And Dallas Turner, with this combine performance, is no doubt a top 10 pick in 2024. But then Chop Robinson, a guy that there was a lot of questions about, especially with how he would test. We knew he was freakishly athletic, but some of these athletic guys don't necessarily test well. Chop Robinson, I think, did that. Great size, yet again, 4.4 40 time, and we keep throwing that out there because that is very fast, especially for these edge rushers. But this is a guy that stock will rise and should rise going into the NFL draft process. He was kind of a question mark. Some had him as a second round, some had him as late as a 4th round pick. I can see all of that happening, but I think it's a safer bet at this point due to this combine performance and how athletic he was on, in those drills, that he is more so of a 2nd to 3rd round pick at this point in time, and 3rd round is even pushing it, right? But shout out to Chop Robinson, a guy that put Penn State on notice, right? But I will say there's some Penn State guys on this list that didn't test so well, and we'll talk about him later on. But Chop Robinson, of course, one of the best 40s on the day and moves extremely well for his size. He is going to rise up draft boards here, going into the draft process. The last guy I want to talk about as a riser here is Nate Wiggins, right? Or at least before we get into the honorable mentions. Nate Wiggins, he had a 4.240 time. Of course, it wasn't 4.21 or 4.22 like John Ross and, of course, Xavier Worthy, but he still had a 4.240 time, extremely fast. He only ran once, I will say, because he felt something pop, which, of course, protect yourself for what matters most, which is the next level. But right now, we're kind of in this hodgepodge, excuse me, where we have this group of Terrion Arnold, Cooper DeJean, Nate Wiggins, and Quinyon Mitchell, where we don't really know who is the cornerback one in this class, and the argument really has come down to a guy like Terrion Arnold or Nate Wiggins. We don't really know who is the best corner in this class. Nate Wiggins has just made a very good case on why. Hey, I'm the best corner in the class. We knew he was great in zone coverage, but just his quickness and all his drills, of course, before that injury were very impressive. I will say though, on the negative side, he was a bit lighter than we expected. Hopefully, from now to the draft process, and maybe in his pro day, he puts on some weight. But at the cornerback position, sometimes if you're great enough, you can get away with, of course, being a little bit lighter. But we'd like to see a little bit more weight on there. Come on, Nate Wiggins, just eat a couple cheeseburgers, right? But then we get into some honorable mentions. We start with Byron Murphy, a guy that stole the show, of course, as an interior defensive lineman. Very, very quick for his size, and he was the guy to watch on day one of the NFL Draft Combine. Brandon Fisk, I know his tape isn't great, but again, just like Xavier Worthy, taking the tape out of things, I think Brandon Fisk, just with his athleticism, made himself a draft-worthy prospect. So, he went from a guy that potentially could have not been drafted. Now, he put himself on the map a little bit more with that athleticism, excuse me. So shout out to Brandon Fisk. I know, again, his tape's not good, but this is a guy that should be drafted now due to this combine performance. Chris Jenkins is another guy like Byron Murphy, where they were in the top 5 of my defensive tackles, guys that I knew their tape was good, but they should also test well, and they both did that at a very high level. So shout out to Chris Jenkins and Byron Murphy, two guys that should be drafted in the first 2 rounds, especially Byron Murphy, right? I had him going 13 to the Raiders here in my previous mock draft. Terrion Arnold, another guy that, again, is in that cornerback 1 conversations. You can make an argument for 3 to 4 different guys, but Terrion Arnold, to me, is my number 1 corner in the class, and he remains that with a very, very solid combine performance overall, right? But the last guy I want to talk about here is a Georgia Bulldog in Javon Boyard, a guy that is my 3rd or 4th ranked safety in my prospect rankings. I'd have to go back and look, but this is the guy that is definitely up there with his solid performance in the range of guys like Cason Bullock, guys that, Tyler Nubin and Cam Kinchens, right? I will say Cam Kinchens and Tyler Nubin are my far and away my number 1 and number 2s. But Javon Boyard definitely makes the case for number 3 right there with a guy like Cason Bullock out of USC. But those are all of my risers. I promise that is it. But let's talk about the flip side here, right? The fallers in the class. I don't have nearly as many fallers because, again, the combine really shouldn't show your weaknesses. It should show your your positives, right? The reasons why teams should draft you, and not the flip side. These athletes here just didn't have the greatest weekends. We're going to start here with Sam Hartman, a guy that was already a day 3 pick, or at least slated to be, right? But this is a guy that just was behind on everything, right? He was just, he didn't have the arm or the accuracy really to keep up with some of these receivers. He was either a step behind all these receivers or he just underthrew a lot of them. But hey, I guess the rumors say that he was sick coming into the draft combine, so maybe that's why he was so off in all of his drills and performances in his 40 as well. But who knows, right? It's just a rumor, and it could just be coming out from himself, right? We don't know with all burners nowadays. But Sam Hartman, again, very solid weekend, or not a solid weekend, a little under the, under the radar, underperforming is a better way to put it. But get ready to hold the clipboard. It is a good way to put it. I could see him being a very solid backup, a guy that's a spot start option for obvious reasons. But Audric Estime, this one hurts because I got a lot of slack for having him as a top 3 running back in my draft rankings. But I will say, look, I still love the prospect despite this draft combine. Look, not everybody tests well. Not everybody is a, put me in a drill and I'm going to be the best here. And some prospects are just, hey, turn on the game film and let me go play on the field. And that is my film, right? That is the reason why you should draft me, not because of how I tested. But Audric Estime, he did look very, very slow. He had a 4.7 40. I know he's a power back, but I think this is a guy that could be a Derrick Henry mold of a running back, right? Where this is a guy that you want to, he can be your bell cow running back, to carry the load for the entire game. But I don't think he's of the level of AJ Dillon, where AJ Dillon's strictly like a power back. I think Audric Estime can be your number one running back on a team, and he could be a guy like Derrick Henry, where over the game, he just wears you down with his side and speed combination. This is the fastest slow guy I've seen in a long time, where you watch his film and it's like, this guy shouldn't be pulling away from these cornerbacks and these safeties, especially when they have head starts on them, 10 to 15-yard head starts. But he does, and he pulls away and then he has really good breakaway speed. But as far as the combine, he did look very slow in all the drills. And I think, right now, the general media thinks he's really just a power back. So I think his stock has fallen a little bit, but I think whoever gets him is going to be very excited with the production that they get, especially because, hey, they might have a franchise guy. Another running back that I did have in my top 8, Dillon Johnson. He's another guy that just didn't really test well. But again, I think when you turn on his game tape, he can be very solid. I don't think his potential is as high as a guy like, as a guy like Audric Estime. But Dillon Johnson can still, again, be very solid in the right situation. Who knows? Maybe if he ends up, in a San Francisco 49ers offense, maybe he can make a name for himself behind Christian McCaffrey and then go get his money elsewhere. There's situations like that can happen. But Dillon Johnson, I think, is very solid as a player on the field. Just didn't test well, and ultimately, I think his draft stock is going to fall because he's another guy that just didn't look very quick and very agile in all of his drills. Troy Franklin, before we talk about him, I guess I'll mention another running back in Bucky Irving. Bucky Irving is another guy that was known to be shifty, and he didn't really have the expected times that we thought he would have over this past weekend. So Bucky Irving didn't have the greatest combine performance either. But his teammate, Troy Franklin, look, he did have a great 40, but, I saw Bengal, of course, talented YouTuber, and of course, a very high inspiration for me as well as many others. And if you made it to this point, go check him out, right? But Troy Franklin, he had a great 40 time, but Bengal pointed out, and it's also on the NFL.com website, that he had the worst 10-yard split out of any wide receiver. So his acceleration is not there, or at least it wasn't there in that 40-yard dash time compared to every other receiver that tested. Regardless, this is a guy that, aside from his great overall 40 time, he didn't really look terrible in drills. He kept slipping. Some people said he was sick, but ultimately, at the end of the day, just like now we have this formulated opinion on Audric Estime, where he's just a power back. I think people look at Troy Franklin now as he's just a deep threat. And I can see that, honestly, right? With how much he was slipping in those drills. Something just didn't seem right with Troy Franklin over his combine performance. But who knows? Maybe that's him. But again, I'm very excited to see Audric Estime and Troy Franklin's pro day. Maybe they look a lot better. But then Bralen Trice on the defensive side of the ball. This is a guy that came in. Of course, we knew he was a little bit heavier, throughout the collegiate football season. I think he was like, what, 6'5", 270? Huge for a defensive end, but he can still move, right? Kind of like a Brandon Graham, where they're heavier set, but they can still move. Bralen Trice, excuse me, just didn't really test well over the weekend. And, there's a lot of categories you thought he would have did better in, right? Some people thought he was going to be the biggest riser here over the weekend, kind of like a Chop Robinson. But Bralen Trice, I think he's probably still a top 5 defensive end. Another guy that really he didn't test well, but again, I think his tape will do him justice and will still leave him as a day 2, day 3 pick. But Bralen Trice, another guy that did not test well. But we talked about Olu Fashanu earlier. We talked about Chop Robinson earlier. Olu Fashanu, of course, did not have the greatest outing over his combine performance. Another Penn State Nittany Lion that didn't have the greatest day is Kalen King, a guy that was once considered a bona fide top 5 corner in this class, has really just fallen down these rankings more and more as we get into the draft process. And he's really just had a terrible couple months here, right? Where his last collegiate game, he was embarrassed by Marvin Harrison Jr., which again, we can't really slight him for that too much, right? Marvin Harrison, at the end of the day, 10, 15 years down the line, we might be saying Marvin Harrison's the greatest receiver of all time. So I'm not going to hold that against Kalen King. But after that, he had a bad Senior Bowl performance, both in the one-on-one drills and in the game. And then he has a bad combine day, most notably with his 4.640. I think as of right now, with everything that we've seen, he's probably a late day two, but most definitely a day three pick, where he's most likely going to be converted to safety. Where a team like the Philadelphia Eagles, they could use a safety after getting rid of Kevin Byard, maybe Kalen King. They take a shot on to fill the void of a Kevin Byard. But we'll have to see, of course. Long offseason ahead of us. But that is going to do it here for today's show. We ran through about 20 risers, of course, about 10 or so fallers in the draft. But again, if you made it this far, this is your reminder. Drop a like, subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 15,000. And of course, we can't get there without you guys. So, of course, if you enjoyed, of course, support the channel. But later on today, we're going to be recording our free agency predictions. So be on the lookout on Thursday. Of course, we're going to be releasing those predictions as free agency starts very soon after. So until then, stay happy, stay healthy, get out of here.